Hello and welcome. Welcome to Everything is Energy, and welcome to one of my favorite energetic alignments of the entire year, the Lion's Gate. In contemporary practice, spiritual practice, the Lion's Gate reaches its peak on August the eighth day of the eighth month. And in 2026, it's the eighth day of the eighth month in the year number one. I'll leave the numerology for a little bit later, but for now, it's worth noting that the Lionsgate arrives at or about near the heart of Leo season, when the sun is moving through the sign that it naturally rules. And, the Lionsgate absolutely, and Leo is fixed masculine fire. As I mentioned, it's ruled by the sun, it's an extroverted sign. And not only is this energy Leo-esque, but the Lionsgate absolutely carries associations with the star Sirius, ancient Egypt, along with just themes of renewal, illumination, abundance, and even, conscious co-creation, which is one of my favorites. And, one of the things that's always drawn me to this particular alignment is that August 8th is a powerful day for manifestation. And, for me, the Lion's Gate reaches much further back. It opens a doorway into humanity's, our ancient relationship with the cosmos, our ancient relationship with the sky. And we can imagine and try to remember and get in touch with the time when the appearance of a star was not merely something beautiful to observe, that carried information for humanity. It announced the changing of a season. It guided communities in their relationship with the earth. And in the case of Sirius and ancient Egypt, the return of this particular star became inseparable with water, fertility, survival, and the renewal of life itself. And if you know my work, you've known I've always loved things connected to ancient Egypt. There's just something about that civilization's relationship with the stars, with how they built their pyramids, and I'll get to that in a moment. And with their understanding of the afterlife and their use of sacred geometry. And even some of the paintings in the pyramids depict something that looks a lot like magic. But they also, they understood the cyclical time that continues to speak to me. And you know, I also feel like ancient Egypt didn't really seem to divide the practical from the sacred in the way that we so often do today, as if there's a hard line between spiritual and mundane. You know, I would imagine that for them, potentially the movement of a star could be both an astronomical observation as well as a divine message. And the flooding of a river, in this case, the Nile, could be both a physical event that would bring fertility and bring the rise of agriculture for the year and power up their pyramids, but also it was an expression of cosmic order. It was an opportunity to receive potential downloads from that star. And, in this case, it was the beginning of their year, and that could be both the turning of a calendar, but also it was absolutely the rebirth of their land. And, the star at the center of this story that I'm speaking of is Sirius. And Sirius is the brightest star in our night sky. And in ancient Egypt, it was known as Sopdet, a name that was later rendered as Sophis or Sothis by the Greeks. And for part of each year, Sirius disappeared into the brilliance of the sun and could no longer be seen. And after this period of invisibility, it eventually reappeared low in the eastern sky shortly before sunrise. And this first visible return of this star, of any star, is called the helical rising. It's the first time when the sun can be seen on the eastern sky just before sunrise. And so the helical rising has nothing to do with the shape of a helix. It's just that idea that you can see it around dawn. And so that could happen, and it does happen to many stars. But in ancient Egypt, the helical rising of Sirius occurred around the same general season as the first signs of the Nile's annual inundation. And the floodwaters carried nutrient-rich silt into the surrounding farmland. They renewed the soil upon which, Egypt agriculture and life depended on the Nile's return. So it wasn't just this small seasonal detail. It was everything. It was a lot. It sustained their agriculture. It replenished the land. As I mentioned, it powered the pyramids. It helped determine whether, communities would experience nourishment or scarcity. So the return of Sirius, it's not only, it's interesting. It's not only root chakra. It's not only third eye. It's, it's something about just the renewal of life itself. And it was connected with the beginning of the Egyptian New Year and with the opening of a new agricultural cycle. So when Sirius disappeared, they entered into a period of darkness. And when Sirius returned, just as the land itself would move through dryness and apparent dormancy, it would eventually be restored by the waters of the Nile. So the star's invisibility lasted approximately 70 days. And that length of time also came to carry associations with the Egyptian funerary traditions and the passage between death and renewed life. So this is one reason why Sirius became so deeply connected with the mysteries of death and rebirth and resurrection. And I'm just mentioning this because it's not simply about agriculture here, right? There's something mystical about it. And so it wasn't just the return of a particular star. This was about the return of possibility. And, I mentioned that Sirius was associated with the goddess Sopdet. And over time, Sirius became closely linked with Isis. Isis is one of the great magical maternal figures of ancient Egypt. She has connections with protection, with healing, with sacred knowledge, with fertility, also with devotion and restoration of what's been broken. And I want to take a moment here just to revisit the myth of Isis and Osiris because they're both relevant here. Osiris is killed and dismembered by his brother Set. I'm just going to give the real brief Cliff Notes version of this. But, and so Isis, after she realizes this has happened, she searches for the scattered pieces of Osiris's body, and they're all over the nation. She gathers them together, and it's through her love, her magic, her devotion, she restores Osiris sufficiently to conceive their child Horus. And so this is not a story of returning to life exactly as it existed before. Rather, it's a story of gathering what's been scattered, what's been dismembered, what's already passed through a living cycle, and creating a new future from it. It's a story of transformation as much as it's a story of death and rebirth. And this distinction feels really, it feels especially meaningful this year because, true renewal doesn't always mean simply restoring the past. Sometimes it means recognizing that the past cannot be reassembled in precisely the same way. Something has ended or something has been lost, and yet through our love, through our consciousness and our creative participation and co-creation, this story tells us that absolutely new life can and will still emerge. So I would offer that Isis teaches us that restoration is itself a form of magic. And, the waters of the Nile carried this same message. The flood disrupted the existing landscape, absolutely, as a flood would, but it also replenished it. And, the river crossed its familiar boundaries, it covered the land, it deposited the fertile material from which the next season would grow. And so I like to think that maybe to the Egyptians, potentially, at least to some, that creation and disruption were not in opposition to each other. They understood that they belonged to the same cycle. And, this offers us a deeper way to understand the Lion's Gate itself as more than merely a day to ask the universe for more. It's an invitation to enter into relationship with renewal. So what cycle has completed or what has become depleted or scattered? And then from that, what's ready to be restored? Remember, not necessarily into its former exact shape, but to a new and more vital expression. And, I want to bring up the Great Pyramid here because my own fascination with Sirius was deepened by its possible relationship with the Great Pyramid at Giza. And within the Great Pyramid, there are several narrow shafts extending from the chambers that are traditionally called the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber. And although they are sometimes called air shafts, their original purpose remains uncertain, and one theory is call those star shafts. And they postulated that some of these shafts were symbolically exactly directed towards the stars that held spiritual or religious significance for the ancient Egyptians. And in this interpretation, the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber may have been oriented toward Sirius. And in the same light, the southern shaft of the King's Chamber may have been oriented toward Orion's belt. And the thought among some is that the adepts and the priests would gather in those chambers on certain potentially nights of the year and receive downloads from those stars in those chambers via those star shafts. And so, Sirius was associated with Isis and Orion was connected with Osiris. So this led some researchers to wonder whether or not the shafts express this celestial journey of the deceased king or symbolically connected the pyramid's inner chambers with the divine realm. And I just want to be clear that this is more of a metaphysical interpretation. Modern archaeology is going to disagree with me a little bit on that. But I always just find it interesting to dabble a little bit in some of the realms that are outside, what's hard and fast known as science, not because they're always right, but because they can lead us to new truths. And so, I think the underlying idea is powerful, that the architecture was being oriented toward the heavens. And, I mentioned the idea of pyramids being these power plants. That's also an idea that is somewhat controversial. Take it or leave it. But maybe it was just not only a monument on Earth, but also a symbolic bridge between the terrestrial and the celestial realms, even if we don't need to know exactly what it was. And, that's part of what the Lion's Gate continues to evoke for me. It really invites us to consider our own alignment. What in our, what if our lives were sacred structure? Where would we be pointing ourselves to? Where would be, you know, what kind of light would allowing us, excuse me, what kind of light would be allowing in to guide us? And, the specific expression of the Lion's Gate portal, I mentioned it's centered on August 8th, and that's a modern spiritual concept. And I kind of really want to say that it's not the same name of an ancient Egyptian festival, and it's not a ceremony that the Egyptians observed on August the 8th. It's a contemporary weaving together of several symbolic strands, and it occurs during Leo's season when the sun moves through the zodiac sign of the lion. And I mentioned Leo is ruled by the sun and is associated with things like courage and creativity and vitality and heart-centered authentic expression. Leo is also a very generous sign. And so this portal is associated with the return of Sirius to the morning sky, although the actual date of its heliacal rising varies by latitude. It's impacted by atmospheric conditions and the observer's location. But, I just want to say it's connected with the numerology of August 8th, the 8th day of the 8th month. And, I would offer that the power of the Lion's Gate comes from the way these different languages of meaning meet or are woven together. Leo absolutely invites us and reminds us to speak and conceive and act through our heart. And, Sirius is reminding and inviting us about cycles of remembrance and renewal. And if we add to that the number 8, 8 is about balance and power and reciprocity, as well as the movement between spiritual and material worlds. So there's kind of a modern ritual threshold here. And if we add to that, it's not just the numerology of 8/8. We've got 2026, which is a number one year. And I spoke about this in the August forecast that, let's remember that we are absolutely in the beginning of something this year. Number one is an initiation, seeds are being planted. It's not a year of full manifestation or robust completion by any sense. And so I mentioned, the 8th of August falls close to the midpoint of Leo's season. And if we think about, you know, the Leo can sometimes be reduced to just being about confidence and visibility and performance and the desire for attention or to be seen. But I would offer that the deeper, more authentic expression of Leo is about presence. If we really sit with what Leo is potentially teaching us here, it's to inhabit our lives fully, to bring our inner light into 3D expression, into visible form or experience, not so that we can dominate a room, but so that we stop withholding what is most alive within us. Let's remember, the sun doesn't ask permission to shine. The sun shines its light on everyone. The sun doesn't compare its light with the light of another star. It radiates because radiance is its nature. And, in the same way, healthy Leo energy absolutely doesn't need to diminish anybody else. Authentic sovereignty is not power over, as we're being reminded as we move through this year. It's the willingness to become responsible for our own creative fire, for our own ability as creators, for who we are as the ones who create everything in our world. And this is why the Lion's Gate is so often connected with purpose and courage and expression and manifestation. It brings us to the heart as the center of intelligence. And I've mentioned before that there is scientific evidence that the heart's electric and magnetic field of radiance, or its signature of radiance, is many times stronger than the brain's. And so if we think about our connection to our heart as the center of our intelligence, we'll get to a meditation here about this, but I just kind of want to lightly note, what wants to be expressed or created through you? Is there some truth that you want to live more visibly, or what would it mean for our lives to be lived with the wholeheartedness of the sun? And, let's remember that Sirius is the spiritual sun. Many believe that there's a binary relationship between Sirius and our sun, and that is what is responsible for what in the Hindu tradition is known as the yuga cycles, the grand cycles of time. Tens and tens and tens of thousands of years where humanity ascends into enlightenment and descends into darkness. And they overlap that with this overlapping, it's almost a little bit like a Venn diagram, but the orbits of the sun and Sirius, they cross over. It's for part of their orbits, but they also get very far away for the other part of their orbit. And it's said that the farther apart Sirius gets from our sun, the more humanity descends into darkness. And it's thought that Sirius, as the central sun to our sun, connects to the galactic center and actually filters information and sends it to our sun, which filters the information and sends it to us. So just by definition, the closer they get, the more the information that's coming through is able to be nuanced just for us. Take that or leave that. um, I've spoken a lot on that in the past, but I just kind of want to say, Sirius is sometimes called our spiritual sun. And, you know, while our physical sun is the star at the center of our solar system, Sirius is much farther out. And, I would say that even if we just think of Sirius as a spiritual sun, it's about a different kind of illumination. The sun is the one that physically shines actual light on us, right? That we need to survive. The spiritual sun is is about something else, and that's why I've spoken about it as downloads. Because if we're thinking about another kind of illumination, we're talking about awakening, we're talking about higher consciousness, ancient wisdom, and just essentially the remembrance of something much larger than ourselves, that we're connected to something so much larger than ourselves. And one basic way that we can think about Sirius is literally as a light that returns after having been hidden. And the message is not that the light was absent, it was simply beyond our immediate sight. And that's an important distinction, because there may be periods where we can't quite see the path ahead of us. We may feel a little bit disconnected from purpose, or maybe unable to recognize the meaning of what we're moving through, or exactly how we're going to get from point A to point B. Yet, the disappearance of visible guidance doesn't at all mean that guidance has ceased to exist. Instead, maybe there are times when we're living through a part of the cycle where the star is hidden in the light of the sun. And the Lion's Gate reminds us that, what has been invisible, especially in the physical world, can absolutely return. So, clarity can return, creativity can return, our sense of participation in life can be reborn. And I want to get again to the number 8 here, because the number 8 is kind of to me, a fascinating visual and symbolic structure. There's two circles, one above and one below, meeting at that central point, right? But when we turn it on its side, it becomes the infinity symbol. And so, the number 8 has the potential to represent the ongoing exchange between above and below, if we look at it as we normally write it and see it, between spirit and matter. But also, if we turn it on its side, it could be giving and receiving, inner authority, outer manifestation. It's the infinity loop is kind of symbolizing something that's always cycles that are always going, that there's a never end. And even though one cycle ends, and as soon as one ends, another completes, that is just the nature of the universe. And I mentioned that eight's often connected with strength and abundance and leadership and responsibility and the ethical use of power. But it's not just the number of getting what we want. Eight really teaches us about, kind of like the infinity loop, circulation. Energy must move, resources must move, power must remain accountable. Giving and receiving must eventually find a sustainable relationship. And so it's speaking about, it's, even as we look at it, it's communicating something about the cyclical nature of the universe. And when the number appears twice as 8, 8, these themes are symbolically amplified. But, I don't necessarily think that this day functions as a cosmic vending machine. We're not being handed unlimited manifestation power simply because the calendar contains 2 8s. I think there's a higher order of interpretation that we can take, and I think that serves us well. 8 8 presents a mirror. It asks us whether our inner world and our outer choices are aligned. And also whether we're prepared to sustain what it is that we say that we want. Be careful what you wish for. And again, can the structures of our lives, the way we've built our lives, really sustain and carry the energy that we're calling in? And 8 reminds us, that manifestation isn't merely about attraction, it's about participation. It really invites and requires us to become a living container for the reality that we're seeking to create. So I also just want to lightly mention that there's a place called the Lion's Gate, a physical Lion's Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. And it's located in the eastern wall of the city. It opens into the Muslim quarter, and it's known by several names, including St. Stephen's Gate, St. Mary's Gate, the Gate of the Tribes. And, there's a few, as there's so many religions that claim that space as their sacred space. When we look, if you go to the Lion's Gate, most recently it was built in sometime around 1538 or 1539, and there are line figures on the facade of this gate. They are widely called lions. Historians generally identified them as leopards or panthers. And, a later legend says that Suleiman, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, was the one who built this gate. And he dreamed he would be devoured by lions because he failed to protect Jerusalem. So he responded by building this wall and placing the lions at the gate. And, the gate also stands right at or around the beginning of the traditional Via Dolorosa, which is the route commemorating the final journey of Jesus Christ toward the crucifixion. And in the Christian tradition, it's called St. Stephen's Gate. And it also links the old city with the Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives, and the Garden of Gethsemane. And while this gate does not have a historical connection with the modern 8-8 Lions Gate portal, I find the symbolic resonance worth mentioning here. Because if we think about, all the different ways that myth and folklore have woven throughout human history, a lion guards a threshold. And we've even modernly, it's not uncommon to see two lions at the entrance of a something in order to, emanate vibes of protection. And if we think about a gate separates one world from another. And passing through a gate changes our relationship to what lies on either side. So the Lion's Gate in Jerusalem, it carries stories of protection and judgment and sacrifice and conflict and pilgrimage and grief. And it reminds us that gates are not always light or easy places. That a threshold, as I mentioned, August is absolutely a month of stepping through the threshold. That a threshold can ask something of us. And we may approach that threshold as one person and leave it as another. And for me, this deepens the Lion's Gate symbolism, which is why I'm bringing it up, because, I feel like the portal isn't simply an opening through which blessings pour. It absolutely is. But I think, especially during this 2026 number 1 year, it's an invitation to walk consciously, to walk through the threshold, deeply rooted and open-hearted. What are we willing to leave outside the gate? What are we prepared to carry through it? Those are really important questions. And who are we becoming as we cross that threshold? And, I mentioned that 2026 is the number 1 year, and that makes the Lion's Gate someone significant. But I also just want to say, give a shout out to the larger astronomical, astrological picture. There's an unusually powerful period on which this Lion's Gate of 2026 is arriving. On August 12th, only 4 days after the 8-8 peak, we're going to experience, and I'll have a whole other podcast on this, a total solar eclipse in the sign of Leo. And astronomically, the totality of that eclipse is going to cross Greenland, Iceland, parts of northern Russia, Spain, a little bit of Portugal. And while a partial eclipse will be visible across a much wider portion of the northern hemisphere, I just kind of wanted to say that, its proximity, the proximity of the Leo solar eclipse. I mentioned I have another podcast. I'm just going to leave that right there and invite you to the podcast about the eclipse. But I think the proximity of the eclipse to the Lion's Gate is important because the Lion's Gate is asking us to recognize our light. And the eclipse temporarily obscures that light. And if we revisit the heliacal rising of Sirius, together the Lion's Gate and the eclipse, they're suggesting a more nuanced story rather than either one would tell on its own. First we remember the light, the Lion's Gate, cosmic downloads. Then we enter the mystery, the eclipse. And, I sense that the eclipse is going to reveal what must change so that our expression can become authentic. And, solar eclipses correspond with accelerated beginnings, changes in direction, and interruption of familiar patterns. And, if we think about just really lightly, what is ready to be eclipsed because it can no longer carry the truth of who we are becoming? And so this makes, the 2026 Lionsgate, at least to me, will feel less like an isolated day of manifestation. It's more like an entrance into an eclipse threshold. I mentioned that August is about kind of stepping through this threshold. And so it feels very much like we're being invited to kind of stand in that threshold. We're not simply calling something toward us, we're preparing to meet an entirely new chapter. And there's one more subtle, but I think it's worth noting, layer to the timing. Mercury stationed direct on July 23rd after moving retrograde through Cancer. And it's completing its post retrograde shadow on August 6th, just right before the Lionsgate peak. And, Mercury's journey through Cancer may have drawn our thoughts back toward memory and family and home and belonging, the stories that we've learned to understand ourselves through. And when Mercury completes its shadow on the 6th, we may begin to feel that something has finally been integrated. And even though it's integrated, let's remember, we're not necessarily returning to the plans we had before the retrograde. And just as the Lionsgate is reminding us, we're not in the story of Isis and Osiris. It's not just about going back to the status quo. There is something about rebuilding and scaffolding up and vibing up and improving and expanding that is happening here. And so, by August 8th, I would just say that there's a sense here that the review is ending, that the road is beginning to open. But yet, because the eclipse is approaching, this is not necessarily the moment to force certainty. This is an opportunity to listen for the direction that is becoming palpable and visible and available. And we can move forward without pretending that we already know every detail. And I think that's significant for the times that we live in. I've mentioned this before. There is no necessary rush to be the one that proclaims that they know what will happen on XYZ, or they understand everything. I think we're living in such transformational times that we're really being invited to stay present, moment to moment to moment to moment. And I mentioned the idea of the lions at the threshold because, across many cultures, lions have appeared as guardians of sacred places, royal power. The Sphinx may or may not be a lion. It's absolutely a cat, and it's guarding a gate and a threshold. And, think about what a guardian does. It doesn't merely prevent entry. It asks us whether we are ready to enter. And that is, from what I understand with Egyptian lore, that is where and how they placed their lions. And there is a tradition for, I don't know how wide it is, but before you enter the Great Pyramid, that you go to the Sphinx and you chat and you see whether or not you're ready to enter. So, the lion represents courage, but courage is not the absence of fear. It's the capacity to remain present at and within the threshold, even when we do not have control over what is coming next. To trust that we are 100% safe and we are always in control of what is manifesting, but it doesn't mean that we need to grasp and reach and force. And I think perhaps this is the deepest invitation of this 2026 Lionsgate. We're being asked to stand at the entrance of a new cycle with an open heart. And we're being reminded that we do not need to rush through, and we do not need to manufacture certainty. That we can pause at the gate and feel the ground beneath us and the sky above us and the energy around us. We can remember that Sirius, what it meant to those Egyptians who watched its return for thousands and thousands of years ago. The promise that the waters would rise again, even when there was no sign that there was water coming. That the soil will be renewed and that life could emerge. And, maybe that's the intention that we carry into this portal, not simply what do I want, but something, a deeper, more authentic question. What within me is ready to live again or expand? What form of abundance would restore rather than deplete me? And, I think at its most fundamental level, what light are we here to embody? We are the change. We are the light that we seek. So I'll just close with, saying the Lion's Gate is just this really wonderful modern spiritual observance, but it's, the symbols that it draws upon are so, so ancient. We have the return of the light of the star Sirius, the rising of the waters of the Nile, the magic of Isis and Osiris, the solar heart of Leo, and also just the infinite circulation of the number 8 and the lion standing at the threshold. And this year, I feel like the darkened sun of an approaching Leo eclipse adds an extra special layer. And to that point, before we get to the meditation, I want to invite you to make sure you're on my email list because I'm offering a free 2-part series to guide us through this eclipse season. It's called Rituals of the Eclipse. And we'll be working with the Lion's Gate. Our first gathering is on August 8th at 12 noon Pacific time. We're going to look at the astrology of the eclipse at that time. We're going to look at our own birth charts and see how this eclipse might be affecting us personally. We're also going to be opening the gate into using and working with roses, making rose incense by the time we get to the second eclipse for an offering and ritual during eclipse season. So to get the free invite to that, the Zoom link, just make sure you're on my email list. Go ahead and get to a meditation now. Go ahead and find some space or place where you can sit or lie comfortably, where you won't be disturbed for this next little bit of time. And begin just by closing your eyes and bringing your awareness into your body. Feel that your spine is straight, that your shoulders are stacked over your hips. Feel the weight of your body being supported by the chair you're seated on or wherever you're lying. And take a nice, easy, but deeper breath in through your nose. And release that breath through the mouth. Once again, breathing in through the nose. And as you exhale, begin to use that exhale as the opportunity for release. Begin to let go of any distractions or any tension that your body might be holding. Let's go ahead and take together 3 more rounds of breath. Deeper, fuller inhale through the nose. As you breathe in, use that as the opportunity to call your awareness here and now. And as you exhale, use that exhalation as the opportunity to release, let go. Any distractions, any tension, anything else that you're ready to let go. 2 more times. And now I invite you to imagine that as you're seated or lying, you're flanked on either side by 2 number 8s, 2 infinity loops that are upright. And whether you're seated or lying, begin to expand your energetic field, your aura out so that you can connect with and begin to experience the vibration of this 8/infinity loop. Feel its steadiness. Feel its cyclical nature. Connect with the flow of the energy that is present on either side of you. And as you begin to tap in and understand the energy of this number 8, you start to recognize that you yourself begin to hum as an infinity loop in number 8 right in between them. that this energy is something that you instinctively know how to embody. And imagine that there's an infinity loop that starts, or the center of it is at the center of your chest, at your heart center, and the top loop goes up, encompasses your throat, your third eye, and your crown. And the bottom part goes down and encompasses your plexus, your sacral, and your root. And that there's this continual flow of energy with your heart at the center. And as we're gathering together around the world, thousands and thousands of points of light and people connecting with the Lion's Gate, begin by opening your heart. Imagine that, well, it is the case, your heart center energetically opens out the front and out the back of you and circulates energy all around you. So just start to experience your heart opening wide and shining brightly. And take a moment now to go down to your root chakra and imagine you're sending roots down into the earth, into the soil beneath you, to root deeply and widely into the earth, into your body. And then at some point in time, these two infinity loops, or number eights on either side of you, you can sense that they're beginning to open to the cosmos, and the crown of your head instinctively syncs up with them and opens up to the heavens, opens up to the night sky. And as you're opening up to the night sky, you find yourself transported across time and space to the Sphinx on the strip of the Egyptian pyramids. And you're standing between the two paws, looking at the heart of the Sphinx and then looking up to its beautiful face. And as you're standing here with your heart open and your crown open and you're deeply rooted, the heart of the Sphinx connects to your own heart, as if to scan you and read you and invite you to step into the threshold. And it's your choice whether or not you want to go. But if you feel like you're ready, you can decide to take a step forward as you're stepping closer to the Sphinx, and you put your hand on the chest where the heart would be of the Sphinx. And as you put your hand there, you're instantaneously transported once again into the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. And you notice that there are four little holes in the wall in this Queen's Chamber. And you walk around each and look up and out through those shafts. And in one of them, you can stop to see that there is a star directly in alignment, as if it's looking down at you. And you can start to feel the light of the star come into this chamber, and it's a vast stone chamber, and it's as if the resonance of the light reverberates around these square stone walls. And the light keeps pouring through, and the vibration keeps getting more rich, more vibrant, more authentically a download for you from Sirius. And you can choose to sit or lie in this chamber right now, but keep your heart open. And imagine that as much light as you're ready to hold, this light is pouring into you and circulating through you. And it's as if your heart is calibrating the light as well, taking in just as much as is ready for you. It comes into your heart and it circulates in that form of the infinity loop all throughout your body, all throughout your field. And just take a few breaths here to experience the flow of this light, the flow of this energy from Sirius into your heart, nourishing you, uplifting you, upgrading you. And as you're here in the Queen's Chamber, notice if there's any other messages that are coming through. You can spend a few breaths here just receiving whatever is yours to receive. And then when you're ready, you can spend as much time seated or lying, taking in this light from Sirius as you would like. But when you feel like you're humming, like you're full, like this download is complete, you can send a pulse of gratitude from your heart up and out that star shaft, out to the star Sirius, as if to say thank you. And as you pulse that gratitude, you're instantaneously transported back between the paws of the arms of the Sphinx. Your hand is on the Sphinx's heart. And again, send a pulse of gratitude to that great lion. And as you do that, you're instantaneously transported back to the space and the place that you're listening to this meditation, that you're meditating in. And before you open your eyes, just begin to notice if there's anything that has shifted within you as you have stepped into the threshold, so to speak. It's as if this Lion's Gate is preparing us for what is to come with the next eclipse. For now, place one or both hands over your heart and give a gesture, a pulse of gratitude to yourself for taking the time to meditate, to pause, to practice, to connect to your heart, to connect to the cosmos. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and just prepare to take this download, this energy, this upgrade with you back out into your life, back out into your world. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm grateful to you. Make sure you're on my email list for the upcoming eclipse gatherings. Have a blessed Lionsgate, bright blessings, and so much love.